Jamie Coots was a controversial character to say the least. By 2012, his outrageous church services had even been showcased on the National Geographic Channel. Coots liked to bring live snakes on stage, his favorite being the rattlesnakes and vipers. The more venomous, the better. He and his congregation believed that his 20 years of handling the snakes, while being bitten no less than 8 times, was proof of God's divine intervention. It was evidence that true believers could always count on God for protection from even the most dangerous creatures and circumstances. But Coots was, well, a kook, and it's hard to have much sympathy for a man who put his own congregation in danger. It would have been one thing if he'd taken all the risk upon himself, but Coots allowed his church members to handle the snakes themselves, telling them that faith would keep them safe. It worked out pretty well for Coots for a while. That's until 28-year-old Melinda Brown died after being bitten by a 1.2-meter-long rattlesnake in 1995. Melinda was taken to Coots' home, where she suffered for 2 days before she died from the bite, and no one called for help until it was too late. Preaching about love and bravery is one thing, but if you're going to go out of your way to test your God, no matter who you're praying to, you're poking the bear. Putting innocent people in the line of fire is absolutely unacceptable. He never bothered to get licensed to carry or keep the reptiles, since no authoritative body would have ever allowed anyone to handle venomous snakes on a stage and with such close contact with the general public. He had a pretty long rap sheet because authorities kept catching him with tanks full of unregistered snakes in his car. It's a little mind-boggling why he was allowed to get away with it for so long, despite operating so openly. Somehow, Coots continued to operate his charlatan church for another 19 years before disaster struck again. But this time, it was Coots himself who suffered the consequences. In the middle of a Saturday morning service, Coots was holding a handful of rattlesnakes when he dropped them onto the stage. This wasn't an accident. He often went out of his way to aggravate the serpents, to show just how far he could take things without fear. Coots picked them up again, and that's when one of the understandably angry snakes bit him. Since he'd been bitten before and never had any adverse reactions, no one blinked an eye. According to another preacher, Cody Wynn, Coots stepped off the stage just a few minutes later to go to the bathroom. But he returned after a few moments and continued the service as if nothing had happened. Now, you might be wondering how Coots could have survived 8 previous bites before. Well, this isn't actually all that uncommon. Snake charmers in India get bitten all the time by the deadly cobras that they handle. The reason is quite simple. It's not possible to tame or train reptiles, but they are perfectly aware that the human that owns them keeps them fed, comfortable, and warm. So even though they don't feel any affection toward them, they don't exactly see them as a threat. The snakes intentionally don't excrete venom when they sink their fangs into their handlers, using the bites only as a warning that they're getting annoyed, never intending to actually kill the people who handle them. But it doesn't take much to push the naturally feral creatures over the edge. Even something as simple as a temperature change is enough to get them aggressive enough to exact the full potential of their venom into the people foolish enough to parade them around like show dogs. Coots was doing everything possible to get the snakes as angry as he could, so the only miracle here is that it took more than 20 years before he got on the wrong side of a rattler who wasn't going to stand the TV star's antics anymore. The other preachers and band members expressed their concern, because Coots was already becoming pale and perspiring profusely before he left. It was quite obvious that the man was in the beginning stages of a severe reaction. They even called 911, but Coots told them that he was just going to go home and lie on his couch and pray like he always did. By the time the paramedics arrived, Coots was already gone. He'd simply gotten into his car and drove himself home before they got there. The paramedics did their due diligence and contacted Coots at his residence. Over the phone, he refused medical treatment and told them that he was doing fine. But the professionals noticed that Coots' speech was slurred and that he sounded faint, so they got into the ambulance and tracked down his address. But it was too late. They found Coots on his couch, unresponsive. They performed CPR and desperately searched for any vital signs as they rushed him to a hospital. But Jamie Coots had finally gone too far. He was dead a little over an hour after the snake had bitten him on the back of the hand. And if you're thinking that the madness would finally end, well, not quite. The church is still very much alive, and they have more snakes on stage than ever, as well as the one that killed Coots. The pastors, including Coots' own son, Cody, took up the reins. But there's at least some good news here. The new generation of preachers are more than willing to seek medical help when they get bitten, and there's sure no shortage of snake bites at the church. You can count on at least a dozen trips to the emergency room every year. They don't allow anyone but themselves to handle the serpents anymore. They've stated that they take full responsibility for their snakes, and that they also take the safety of their congregation to heart, just like any good shepherd would. But some say that despite these new safety precautions, it's only a matter of time before more people like Jamie Coots and Melinda Brown meet their terrifying final affliction. Audrey Macintosh was enjoying the last slivers of summer. The 18-year-old had just finished high school, and she was going to be entering the crazy rat race that was college life in just a few weeks. She was taking in every last ounce of the Georgia summer while she still could. While her parents were at work during the day, Audrey slept in late, or she met up with friends as often as she could before they were separated at the end of summer. Most of her high school buddies were off to college themselves, or they'd signed up for apprenticeships, and a few were even going abroad for a gap year before they made the commitment of seeking a higher education. The only real responsibilities that Audrey had was to keep the dishes and the laundry clean, as per her mother's request. Not that Audrey minded at all. It was hardly too much to ask, and most afternoons she even started dinner to save her mother the trouble. They lived right on the outskirts of town, only a 10-minute drive out, and their closest neighbor was an elderly couple that had a farmhouse half a mile away. Audrey visited Mr. and Mrs. Hentley at least once a week when she felt like taking a walk. Usually she'd bring a container of strawberries from the garden. Audrey loved the old couple, and she thought that she'd miss them most of all when she went away at the end of summer. On that fateful summer morning, Audrey was up earlier than usual. The sound of her parents' cars pulling out of the driveway shook her out of her slumber, and she couldn't manage to get back to sleep. So Audrey got up, took her morning shower, and got the first load of laundry going. Dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, Audrey spent the next 40 minutes going over the boxes she'd packed for her dorm room while she waited for the load to finish. And just in time when the sun shook off the morning dim, Audrey was out with her basket to hang the clothes out to dry. The Macintosh family never used a dryer in the summer, preferring to save the electricity when the sun was out to do the job just as well as a machine would have. The morning was still young, but it was already hot, and the birds were out to greet the girl when she stepped out. Audrey turned her head to look for the twittering birds above her head, wondering what species they were. In the process of turning, her laundry basket knocked on the gutter on the side of the house. It wasn't hard. Heck, Audrey didn't even notice the slight knock, but the serpent inside of it did. Audrey shielded her eyes against the sun, distracted by the yellow warblers singing from the top of the house's chimney. She didn't hear the angry hiss that escaped the gutter, nor did she hear the rustle when the 23-inch Copperhead started irritably moving amongst the dried leaves where it had been relaxing just a second before. When Audrey had her fill of the warblers, she turned back to head to the washing line, and again she bumped against the gutter. Only this time the snake inside wasn't startled unexpectedly. It was already agitated and alert. The moment the slight knock rocked the gutter again, it shot out like a brown bolt of lightning. Audrey hadn't bothered to put on shoes before stepping out of the door, so its fangs had no resistance when it sank into her calf just above her right ankle. Audrey gasped in shock, and the pain was instantaneous, even as the viper whipped back into its hidey hole. The burning sensation that hit her was so sharp that it took her breath away. Audrey had only seen its head, but she knew exactly what kind of snake this was. half of the children in the United States can identify a copperhead. The most venomous viper in the U.S. is notorious for its deadly and painful bite. Audrey had grown up being warned about them, and with the spreading burn that was making its way up her calf, the panic began to rise in her chest. Panicking was the worst possible thing that could have befallen Audrey at that moment. Had she kept her cool and gone to the phone to call for help, she probably would have survived like most snakebite victims do. But Audrey didn't even think of picking up the phone. She wasn't thinking straight at all. Dropping her basket of whites on the ground, Audrey began to run. She was running toward the first thing that came to mind: people. And the closest people in the area were the Hentleys. For half a mile, her heart beating in her chest like thunder, and the fire in her leg crawling up higher with every step, Audrey sobbed and ran to her death. Her raging heartbeat was circulating the venom faster than ever. The muscle, fueled by adrenaline, beat fast and irregularly as a result of the poison coursing through her veins. Halfway through the open field, and the bite marks were already starting to turn black. 3/4 of the way, and Audrey's vision began to blur, and the bile started pressing up against her throat. Had it not been for the fear and hysteria driving her, Audrey would have collapsed due to the complete numbness in her legs and arms. It took Audrey only 5 minutes to reach the Hentleys' driveway before she finally slowed down. Relaxing at the sight of Mr. Hentley, who just happened to be in the garden, when she slowed down to a stop, the full force of the venom's effects hit her like a train. Audrey began to vomit so violently that she sank to her knees. Her bitten legs stuck out at an odd angle, no longer able to function due to the nerve damage already setting in. Mr. Hentley dropped the garden hose and ran to the crying, vomiting, and obviously distressed teenager, yelling for his wife and moving his legs as fast as his 74-year-old body could go. Completely dumbfounded, Mr. Hentley had no idea what had happened to Audrey, and she was still heaving so much that she couldn't get a word out between the bile and the tears and her moans of pain. Audrey's leg was on fire, burning like she'd stepped into an open flame. The old man cradled her head while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. Somewhere in those long, agonizing minutes, Audrey managed to gasp out a few words, enough to make him aware that a copperhead had bitten her. She mumbled some nonsense about birds on a chimney, but her delirious explanation was enough to direct him to Audrey's leg. He saw the punctures on her calf. The skin was now completely black, and the discoloration was spreading fast. Audrey saw the lights from the ambulance pull in before she gave one last retch and promptly passed out. As the paramedics loaded her into the back, Audrey began to convulse. Her condition was deteriorating faster than it should have. Dehydrated from the sprint and the heat of the mid-morning sun, her heart had circulated the venom much faster than it would normally have. Her red blood cells were almost completely wiped out, destroyed by the hemolytic effects that come from viper bites, and as doctors would later discover, Audrey had an undiagnosed heart condition that wouldn't have been life-threatening under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances after all. She never regained consciousness after passing out in the driveway with her head cradled in Mr. Hentley's lap. For 2 days, her parents stood vigil at her bedside, but no amount of anti-venom or treatments could repair the damage done to her entire circulatory system. Even with her heart condition, Audrey was young, fit, and should have been one of the 99.9% of Copperhead's survivors. But when fear robbed her of her senses, her instincts led her to do everything that she shouldn't have. While her parents remained in hospital, Mr. Hentley went searching for the snake. The laundry was still strewn across the grass, so he knew where to start looking, and ironically enough, he too knocked against the gutter by accident. But unlike Audrey, Mr. Hentley was actively keeping his ears and eyes open for a reptile. He heard the angry hiss from inside and put the pieces together. The viper was quickly dispatched, and he removed the serpent from the property. On the second day, when the news spread that Audrey's heart had failed and she was no longer alive, the Hentleys cried as bitterly as the Macintosh family. They'd never had children of their own, and Audrey was an only child. In a way, 2 households lost their only daughter on that summer's day in 2001, when Audrey Macintosh met her terrifying final affliction. Eugene Deleon wasn't your average 60-year-old. Eugene was a snake wrangler. He made it his life's mission to educate people of the dangers and the beauty of these magnificent animals. Even though his love for the creatures that have inspired fear in humans since the beginning of time was a showstopper at events, Eugene was no showman for the fame of it. He genuinely believed and fought for conservation, and he did everything he could to teach people how to respect them. In his off time, Eugene answered calls to remove snakes from homes and buildings, and he was a volunteer firefighter. Everyone who knew him said that they could always count on a smile and a library's worth of knowledge about the world of reptiles. Eugene loved snakes most of all, but his knowledge around all things reptilian did not end with snakes. Turtles, lizards, crocodiles. If it had scales, then Eugene was the man to go to. He specialized in rattlesnakes and traveled the country to showcase his vast collection. Eugene was a familiar face at almost every convention and festival that needed a snake handler. The Rattlesnake Roundup Festival event takes place every year in May. Rattlesnake roundups, or rattlesnake rodeos as they are sometimes known as, is a very popular pastime in the southern states of the USA. Texas especially is known for them. Though the festivals are centered around rattlesnakes, they certainly aren't the only reptiles out for display. Here they host classes on how to handle snakes, anti-venom production, snakeskin leather, food products, and culinary classes around cooking with snake meat. You name it, you can find it here. Back in the old days, this was a deplorable sideshow event that didn't have a great track record of treating its animals very well or putting in a whole lot of effort into safety standards. But since the 90s, strict laws around safety and animal care turned the snake rodeos into an excellent platform to teach the public about conservation efforts, and that even though these are incredibly dangerous animals, much more can be gained from respecting and protecting them than simply eradicating them off the face of the earth. It's not the kind of event that everyone will enjoy, given that there's plenty of live butchering going on. But for the most part, the Rattlesnake Roundup aims to educate more than anything else. Eugene was attending the festival for the 6th year in a row, that year in 2022, and he and his prize rattlers were one of the star attractions. The first day went as you'd expect. Hundreds of people stopped by Eugene's stall to watch him handle the live reptiles and listen to his lectures about safety precautions and descriptions of the species' behavior and habitat. The second day, Saturday, was even busier than the first. By the afternoon, those who had to wait to get off work finally arrived, and thousands of people had already visited and participated in most of the festivities. The constant trampling of feet, the strange smells, and the unending drone of voices and shouts from the scores of people milling around was starting to get on one rattler's nerves. After being hauled out of the dark and warm box multiple times that day, you almost couldn't blame it for having enough of being disturbed. Eugene used his handling stick to lift a particularly large specimen out of the box, and the crowd oohed and awed their appreciation as he lifted it high above his head. The 8-foot-long creature reacted to the bright lights and the dizzying amount of movement around it in a very predictable way. It lashed out. Like lightning, it struck Eugene from above, landing 2 strikes in quick succession on his shoulder. The attack was so swift and underwhelming that most of the spectators missed it completely, and the few who did catch it were immediately put at ease by Eugene's calm demeanor. He simply smiled, placed the snake back in its box, and motioned for his son, who was also an expert handler, to take over the display. Eugene walked to the medic station, and in that short walk he already started feeling the effects of the venom. His shoulder burned like fire, and the pain was spreading down his arm and across his chest. Eugene knew better than anyone that being bitten on the upper body was a death sentence. There are just more blood vessels and major arteries to transport the deadly venom across the body, and once it reaches the lungs and the brain, well, your chances of survival drop significantly. When he reached the station, Eugene collapsed before he could even get a word out. Through blurred vision and his labored breathing, he could only point to his shoulder, indicating where he was bitten. Ironically, the biggest festival around rattlesnakes doesn't keep any anti-venom on the premises. It's a heavily controlled substance that can only be administered at a hospital. And to make matters worse, rattlesnake anti-venom can't be stored in the long term. It has to be prepared only when a patient who needs it comes in. The preparation takes hours, and the biggest struggle is keeping the victims alive until the preparation can be completed. Eugene knew, even before the helicopter arrived, that he wasn't going to make it. A bite that high on the body, and at his age, well, his chances of surviving were next to none. And sure enough, Eugene lost consciousness just as the aircraft lifted off the ground. Paramedics notified the hospital of the case, and they rushed to get the process of preparing the anti-venom started. But 8 hours after being bitten, Eugene breathed his last. He never woke up after he passed out on the festival grounds. His death caused an uproar. Rattlesnake rodeos were once again in the headlines, and people were questioning the festival's safety standards. But honestly, Eugene did everything by the book, exactly like he should have. This truly was just a tragic and unfortunate accident. His family has come out with statements that he died doing what he was passionate about, and that they would continue his legacy of education and awareness for as long as they live. Every event, festival, and conference that Eugene ever showed his beloved scaly companions at reached out to fund his funeral. And a fair amount of citizens who he'd helped during his firefighting days also chipped in. It became very clear just how many people Eugene Deleon reached during his lifetime. His passion drove him, but sadly, at the end of the day, it was also that passion that led to his terrifying final affliction.